Site assessment, which kind of sounds scary, and I'll talk about that in a second, and also regenerative landscape design principles, which will come towards the end of what I'm going to discuss with you. This is a process that and information that's near and dear to my heart as someone with formal landscape architecture training, who then went into coastal policy and law, and now work in environmental outreach. And I'm very concerned with the nexus between what people know and what they do. And so I'm going to apply that to this talk, which will really focus on backyard landscape management. But before I get into that, for those of you who are not master gardeners or friends of mine or Cooperative Extension family, I'll just tell you a little bit quickly about what we do. Cooperative Extension is the part of the University of Rhode Island that is actually responsible for bringing science out into the community. So that's a unique mission that we share with land-grant institutions across the United States. Every state in the US has a land-grant institute, at least one land-grant institution. In New Jersey, it is Rutgers, for example. New York, it's Cornell. Pennsylvania, it's Penn State, and the list goes on. And each of those land-grant institutions has an extension service, and all of them focus really on the most pressing environmental issues of our time. In Rhode Island, we are very small and very mighty, and we focus in on land stewardship, food systems and agriculture, water resources, energy literacy, and healthy lifestyles. And all of our programming falls within those. And so when you're looking for good information that you can trust, we are one of the places you should come to first, especially if it relates to horticulture or agriculture or any of these, any topics that fall within these strategic areas. And I just want to mention that we have some guiding principles, and I think these help to kind of explain what our mission is, and that is that we're dedicated to Rhode Island's people and the communities you all live in, and we're committed to improving your quality of life, and where appropriate, your livelihood and the health of our natural environment, perhaps most importantly. That is why I do this work. We also believe in social justice, and we're really striving more and more to deepen our cultural understanding and proficiency, so that we're inclusive and serving all different people, not just people who look and sound and know the things we know. So that's really kind of the challenge, I think, of this decade for us in Extension, is making sure we're serving everyone. And so ultimately, when you break it down, we're bringing science out to you. So Taylor, I'm just going to ask you to mute everyone for me, and thank you all for being here. If you want to enter questions in the chat, I'll try to get to them as we go. You're not late. This is my first content slide, so I'm going to be a little snarky here and say that I'm going to talk about site assessment. That's also known as site inventory and analysis, which is also known as taking your backyard on a date. Or the things smart people do to avoid wasting money. Depending on who I'm talking to, I posit this process in a number of different ways. What's important for all of you to understand is that if you have one or more of your senses, you can use them to make sure that you're not making decisions that cost more money than you should be spending, and also that you're not making decisions that negatively impact the environment. And so I'm going to take you through this process, and by 8 o'clock, I think most of you will be pretty fluent in what site assessment is and why it's important to do when you're working in a landscape of any kind, really, whether it's a small garden bed or new construction, and I'll get into that. So what is it? We have this young lady staring at this really ugly electrical transformer, but she is taking inventory of what's in front of her. And site assessment is an approach for A, identifying, and then B, analyzing three categories of information that fall within the natural environment, the built environment, and the social environment. And those are three very different things that I'll go through. And when we're talking about identifying or inventorying information, that's basically taking stock of what you have. The analyzing part is when you say, okay, here's what I've observed. Now, what does this really mean? It's the so what, and I'll talk a little bit about how to get there, and then we'll touch on some design principles. So a lot of people will say, when should I do site assessment? Well, in my opinion, you can do it anytime. You can do it at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of any landscape improvement projects. Again, if you're converting a small lawn area to a garden, or if you're converting a garden back to forest, or if you're turning a forest into lawn, or if you've just bought a new home and it's a clean slate, or you're moving into a home that has pretty good foundation in the landscape, you can do this process at any point. And anytime you're making any decisions about, I tell professionals, anytime you're taking a billable hour, you better have done site assessment before you send the invoice, because that shows your client that you have the information you need to make decisions that they're really trusting you to make. So basically, as the last bullet says, anytime you're spending money on your landscape, this is a great process to work. And I'll show you where you can find more resources to help you do that. So why should you do it? And I take the hard line on this. Number one, knowledge is power. The more you know, the smarter the decisions you make are. And I think secondly, gardens or the outdoor landscape add value, tremendous value to your home. If you're talking about a park, the health of the park, the layout of the park, the decisions that are made in the park have an impact on people. And so whether you're sitting here listening to me as someone who, works in the landscape as a profession, or if you're just wanting to take your backyard on a date, or wanting to give yourself more information, this is relevant to everyone. And I think if we all take elements of what I'm talking about, the earth would be a lot healthier. So really what to take away here is that the more you know, the more informed choices you can make. And you when you're working outside in any capacity, you don't want to be the carpenter who shows up to build something without his tools. So when we're gardening, when we are managing a landscape for someone else, when we are changing significant parts of an existing landscape or a new landscape, you want to have information about the environment. So I think I've hammered this point. This is why site assessment is so important. So how do you do it? This is where I'm really going to break it down. And here's the process for you. It's really simple. The first thing is that you have to go outside. I've had, and I won't throw anyone under the bus with names, but I've had professionals in training programs that I've offered come in and say, oh yeah, I was in my office this winter doing site assessments for my clients. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That implies that you never went outside. And I don't want to be too cynical, but it's so important that we use our senses, even if you're missing one or two of them. There are things you can gather by smell, by hearing, most importantly by sight, also by touch, that are going on in the landscape. And what site assessment helps you to do and encourages you to do is go outside and observe what's happening and then write it down. So I show these plans of, some of them are a little bit more professional, but basically this is the beginning of someone going outside, and I'll show you iterations of this and just writing down, okay, this is where this is, and this is where this is, and we'll get more into that. The other part of site assessment is is gathering information that you can't see, that requires you to do a little bit of research. And this day and age, you're going to probably do that research at your dining room table on a laptop. Maybe you still have an encyclopedia set. I think you're cool if you do. Maybe you look stuff up in there, but most of the time you're going to be looking at resources on the internet, preferably science-based resources to find information you need. And I'll show you some examples of what I'm talking about. And then you want to write that stuff down too. And ultimately, the so what comes when you look at everything you've gathered and then you say, okay, I can buy that dwarf Japanese maple Rhode Island red that I've been eyeing, and I got my tax return because I know I have a full sun area here with fairly well-drained loamy soil that has a relatively neutral pH, and that tree is not going to die a year after I plant it. So that's ultimately what we're getting to. Jean asked a question about what am I using for graphics. I actually, when I have to draw things, I still do it by hand because I'm not willing to spend a lot of money on drafting programs, but there are free programs, and I would just, there's AutoCAD, of course. MicroStation is the one I used long ago in school. SketchUp is another one. So there's free versions of all of these programs you can use. So again, you want to remember what kind of information you're looking for, and it falls into these three categories: natural environment, built environment, the social environment, and then their relationship to each other. So what does that mean? And what do we do? Again, I'm just reiterating, you have two jobs. One is to use your eyes or another sense or two, and then the second is to use resources where you can find information. And this will all make more sense as I get into these examples. So first thing, I'm sorry that's a little pixelated, but you need a piece of paper or a roll of trace paper. If you're a gardener or someone who thinks about how different areas of the landscape interact with each other, a roll of trace paper is a great thing to buy. Because it's a really useful way to layer different types of information on top of each other, and you can peel them back, and I'll show you what I mean in a little bit. So the base map is where you start from, and so I've had some folks go to the town hall. You're going to have to call these days, but you can get a plat map. Sometimes they're available online depending on the municipality you live in, and that gives you the boundaries of your property. And then it might even include, depending on the tax assessor's hipness, the footprint of the dwelling, where the garage is, where the driveway is. So that can be a really great start to a base map. I know in Warwick, I own a home there, and I was able to get the tax assessor map of the property, and it was a great starting point. So always start there, either online or by calling the town hall for something to work with. And basically what you do when you create a base map is just start with the characteristics of the built environment. So if there's a house on the property or if there's a yurt, that's cool. Mark it down. If you have a shed, mark it down. Mark the limits of a deck, the driveway, pathways, the sidewalk and where the road is. All of the built parts of your landscape. Another thing that's really important to include, if you can somehow, are where the utility lines go, both above ground and underground. If you're doing this for your own, backyard gardening purposes, and you're not doing a massive overhaul of a landscape, you don't need to get to the dig safe level, but it is good to know generally where utilities are on the property, especially overhead. For example, if you do site assessment and all you do is go outside and look for your overhead utility lines, you're going to know not to plant a tree right under them, right? Hopefully. So that's one example of how this type of knowledge can help you make design decisions. So this is all the different kind of information that you gather during site assessment. Depending on why you are here listening to me talk about this, you're not all going to be interested in all of this. information, but these are kind of the categories that we plop everything into. And I always tell master gardeners and professionals this when we share this information, and if we were here in person, I would ask you how these are organized, but I just point out that these are in a kind of a hierarchy from, oh, Eric, you've already seen me present this. So Eric's right. He's saying these are listed in order of their ability to be changed. And so, and the irony here is that anthropogenically, we've managed to figure out how to change the climate, but we're not going to go there. We're going to focus on the fact that if you think about it, it's a lot easier to amend soil than it is to get an excavator or some huge piece of equipment to change the slope of a landscape. I mean, I think we can all agree on that. It's also not very possible if you need rain to say, hey, rain, please. So these, generally, when I'm bringing this up, because when you gather all this information, you want to start making decisions about things you can change from the top of this list down. So if you have I'll give you one example and then I'll keep going because this will, again, make more sense as I go. If you do site assessment and you see that you've got some drainage challenges, what I would advise is that instead of hiring someone to come out with big giant equipment and change the slope of the landscape to make water flow differently in a certain area, maybe what you would do instead is either move where people utilize the space so that the water isn't an issue, or you amend your soil to condition it to allow more infiltration to happen. And again, I'll build on that, but we don't want to make changes to the landscape, even though we can, to things that are further down on this list, because that causes more harm than good in many situations. So I hope that makes sense. It's an important point for me to make.
Okay. What was the last, it's Debbie Roden, what was the last item on that? It's stuck behind my buttons.
Oh, it's climate.
Climate, okay.
So yeah, soil is the easiest thing to change. And, it's kind of ironic because we have changed the climate, but that is not, the point that I'd make there is if you're living in zone 7 and you see a plant at the nursery that's really suited to zone 10, nothing you do is going to make that zone 10 plant live in zone 7. We can't change. It's, so you want to make decisions higher up on this hierarchy. So I'm going to go through each of these categories and give you examples of information you would want to gather. And again, this isn't all going to be relevant to everyone, but I think it's enlightening for those of us who do plant stuff. And, this is kind of a review, but some of these terms might not be so familiar to all of you. So climate, I'm now going to start at the bottom of that list. So these are the things we can't change individually. And these are things you have to look up. So one thing I'll also point out about all of these slides is that in parentheses, it's either going to say research or observation. The things that say research mean that you can't go outside and find the answer. So please don't say, well, Kate told me I could just go outside and look around. You're not going to find the plant hardiness zone by looking around. You have to look that up. So the research stuff is stuff you'll do inside at the dining room table on the laptop. Climate is the limiting factor for plant and animal life in any area. In landscape and gardening matters, we care a lot about plant hardiness zone. This is an image here of a plant hardiness zone map. And I just point out that these lines are moving up, as the climate warms. And so, where I grew up in Harmony, which is a village in Gloucester, I was in zone 5B. Now it's definitely 6A to 6B in that area, and that's just over the last 10 or 15 years. So you can find this information online. You also probably want to know your average last frost date if you're going to grow vegetables or things like that, because that can play a lot into what you can bring outside and when. In terms of observation for climate, these are also things we can't change, like prevailing wind direction. I always show this ridiculous picture of the tree leaning over that I keep saying I'm going to replace with an image from Beavertail State Park, where the cedar trees are literally leaning, and one side of them has stunted growth because they are constantly whacked with prevailing wind off the ocean, and that those trees are actually adapting to that stress. And so one of the things on your landscape you want to figure out is, do I have a prevailing wind issue? And you can look for that, looking for trees that lean, or looking for any kind of plant with stunted growth on one side. That's a good indicator of high wind exposure or prevailing wind direction. The other thing about climate is the sun. And you know, I start with these slides because this is where you should start too. If you don't know how much sun you get on a property, you shouldn't be buying plants, because on every plant tag, it'll either show you a filled in circle, which means, well, it depends on the brand, I guess, but a filled in circle can mean full sun. A half full circle means part sun, and then no circle at all, or a black circle can mean full shade. You guys know what I'm getting at. That those markings are there because plants tolerate different levels of sun exposure, and you don't want to put something that prefers full shade in an area of full sun because it's going to dry out. So this seems pretty intuitive, but we see people make this mistake all the time. I'll point out here that sun location is a little bit different than sun exposure. You can figure out sun location by looking at where the sun rises in the morning and where it sets in the afternoon, because that can tell you a tremendous amount about where shadows are cast, either by the house or existing plants or other types of, you know, tall infrastructure or vegetation that are on the property. And by figuring that out, you're going to eliminate potential challenges with things either having too much sun exposure or not enough. So this is a really important part of the site assessment observation process that you should start with. Landforms, that next category, and this is generally an unchangeable site feature. Again, we have the ability to get earth moving equipment in. This is an image of a golf course where the earth was moved to create different topography and even ponds. We don't want to see people do that to the extent practicable, because the natural hydrology on sites that are undisturbed exists for a reason, and that is to make sure that runoff is able to infiltrate and find low points in wetlands and be cleansed before it reaches a surface body of water. When we change natural landform shapes, that changes water quality protection. And that's kind of a heady thing, but it's important. And so again, you know, when you're doing kind of your observation practice around the landform, you want to say, like, what's my slope? If you want to figure your slope out, you're going to measure, actually, you should probably look that up because I can't explain to you with the amount of time I have, but it's rise over 1 and you multiply by 100 and you'll get a percentage for slope. So I want to talk about, I'm going to really focus a little bit on soil, landform, water, because we can solve a lot of water quality degradation issues by knowing how water moves. So one of the things you can do as an observation, hi Laura Wilson, what a pleasure. One of the observation activities you can do is conduct a runoff test. Those professionals who are here may recognize this as a perk test. It's basically very similar. And why do we do a runoff test? Well, one of the reasons, or a perk test, we want to see what the carrying capacity of the soil is when it rains or when there's a really intense storm. That can tell you a lot about your existing soil texture, but it can also tell you a lot about what you might be able to do to manage water on your site. And so what you do is, and I'm realizing what I did. Let me go forward. So this image is what I should be showing on that other slide. My apologies, I switched this around. So ignore this picture. A runoff test is not a perk test. A runoff test is literally where, I'm going to go back to this image, while it's raining or after a storm event, you look outside, most likely in an area where there is a little bit of a slope. You see where that rainfall or that flow is flowing from and to. The runoff test is a great way to figure out where your natural runoff channels are. And if you're interested in learning more about different stormwater management practices, I'm probably going to do another webinar on that topic in June or July, and we'll let you know about that. But a runoff test, again, and I'll just go back to the texts, you want to look where water is naturally sheeting. And even more importantly, where water is standing or ponding. Because if water is standing or ponding in a particular area, that immediately tells you that that soil is either compacted already, that the predominant texture is closer to clay or silt than it is sand or loam, which can be a not great thing to deal with. And 3, that you probably do not want to try to manage stormwater in that area because it does not have a high drainage capacity. So hold that thinking and hold this image in your mind. And I really need to change that. I'm going to skip that. So let me just go here. The other water / landform related observation and test you can do on your own is what I call the DIY soil permeability test. Rolls right off the tongue. And this is another fancy way of calling the thing professionals call a perk test. So what you want to do is dig a 6-inch wide by 12-inch deep hole in the ground, and then make sure no one's going to step into it and break their ankle. And once you have the hole dug, you want to fill it with water and let it drain. And what that does is it simulates that there was just a significant rain event. It saturates the soil with water. After you fill it with water and let it drain, you want to fill it with water again. And if the water, the second time you fill it, doesn't drop at least 2 inches in an hour, you have fairly poorly drained or compacted soil. And I'm going to say that again in a couple different ways. Do you need to stand outside for an hour and with a stick in this hole and watch the level go down? Absolutely not. If you want to do that, that's fine, because you can probably observe a lot of other things going on. But 2 inches in an hour is the equivalent of a half an inch in 15 minutes. So in that other picture, I'm just going to go back for a second. There's a ruler in the ground here. So this person has actually filled this hole up to here, and it's drained all the way down pretty significant amount. This is probably mostly sandy loam, and it looks like there's a lot of sand. So you're measuring how much this water level goes down over a period of time. So again, if you've got an hour to sit there with a cold beverage, you're looking for a 2-inch drop. If you only have 15 minutes, you're looking for a half an inch. So if you figure this out and you're saying to yourself, why would I ever dig a hole and fill it with water to do this? This can give you a ton of information about your predominant soil texture, which is going to play into what types of plants you can choose for your site. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. It can also tell you if a particular area is suitable for something like a rain garden. And I'm not going to go into rain gardens tonight, but you can do a little bit of research. There's a lot of good work done at Rutgers and Cornell about rain gardens, and even at URI, you can find some information. But this is a really good way to kind of figure out what you're dealing with in terms of soil, and the gardeners in the group know how important that is, and I'm sure the rest of you do too. So I'm going to go back to this. The other part of the water conversation that's important to look at during site assessment is these things that are in bold here, and these are things you need to observe. So, you know, any vegetable gardener will tell you that they're not going to, if they have a choice to site the vegetable garden in a full sun area that's closer to their spigot, they're going to do that rather than locating it across the property in that full sun area that's 20 yards away from the spigot, because that means that they either have to run a hose that's connected to a drip line all the way out to the vegetable garden, or they're dragging a hose in and out to water every day so that the lawnmower doesn't run it over. So, you know, the location of your water source is really, really, really important. And a lot of people overlook that. So that's an important thing to mark down. If you have more than one on your property, mark them all. And also, if you know where there are pipes and things, that gets into, you know, where you may or may not want to be digging deep holes for tree installation and things like that. Another really important thing to look for are sources of runoff and pollution. So when you break this down to brass tacks, I can tell you with certainty that rooftops, driveways, the road you live on, and any bare soil that people walk on a lot, and any pavement basically, are going to be sources of runoff and most likely non-point source pollutants. So that's not good. But we all have these types of impervious surfaces that don't allow water to flow through them. And so if you can figure out where runoff is generated and then draw arrows on your plan that show where the water is flowing to via that runoff test I talked about, that'll give you a lot of information about you know, where to put the plants that like to have wet feet or that like to have wet soil in. You'd want to put those at the base of where the water is flowing to. On the other hand, you know, if you have a slope like this and you know that there's runoff flowing down it, you're not going to put plants that want that are drought tolerant, because those prefer to be drier. So a lot of this information, as you gather it, can help you with plant selection, and I will go into that. So another really, I always show this image every time I teach this topic, and it's very subtle, but it's significant. If you ever see things like what I'm showing in these pictures on the right happening, that means you have active erosion. Those are called rills. And that means that water is flowing over the surface of the ground at a velocity or a speed that's causing it to pick up sediment as it flows. And that sediment ultimately, because of how we've engineered our stormwater systems, is ending up in a storm drain and then ending up in a stream somewhere nearby. And so this bottom picture in particular, they should really have a sediment barrier up. So anytime you see what we call a silt fence or straw bales that are staked in, or those core logs that are stuffed with mulch, kind of look like big Tootsie Rolls, those are there to prevent sediment from eroding and going into our storm drain systems, because that's actually pollution. And so if you ever see this happening on a landscape, the best thing to do is seed immediately, or put up some kind of sediment barrier, but I digress. So what I want to show you is that this image on the left is a picture of someone's house that I went to, someone I was helping with some design work. And this area where you can see the potted plants is the edge of a pond. And they told me this story about how when their when their children were growing up, there were tons of tadpoles and pollywogs and all this newts and, you know, all of these wonderful things that I remember being around when I was young that are now not there anymore. And I thought to myself, the first thing I thought of was, well, there's grass right up to the water's edge here. And the second thing I noticed is that there was this really subtle discoloration over the lawn. And what I realized is that this dirt road, every time it rains, was losing a little bit of itself, and it was flowing over the lawn and very slowly over time covering the bottom of this benthic pond environment with extra sediment. And over a long period of time, that actually changed the benthic or bottom environment, so that some of the native organisms that were used to rearing their young there didn't go there anymore. And that's why those species disappeared, I would like to believe. And so I bring this to your attention because it's a very subtle thing that I noticed, but it told me a lot about a problem that was occurring, and B, an opportunity to fix it. And so I don't have an after picture, but if you can envision, and I'll use a pointer here, I basically created a very shallow depression where this flow, because it was a little bit of a slope, could come into and be held so that it would infiltrate down into the soil instead of continuing on to flow into the pond. It's basically a rain garden. And I planted it with all drought tolerant species, which is what you put in rain gardens, despite what it sounds like. And you know, that pond is not suffering anymore from extra sedimentation. And so that was, you know, a very subtle thing I noticed that I was able to fix with plants and a little bit of modification to the ground plane. So I don't know why this is pixelated. That drives me crazy. But this is, you know, when I was talking earlier about laying trace paper down, you might, if you had a roll of trace, you know, lay another piece down and start marking the stuff you figured out when you were doing your climate, landform, and water observation and research. Those 3 steps, that's where we're at. And so in this image, you know, these arrows are showing you where water is flowing from. You know, that's usually the infrastructure that's present on the property. Is also showing where water ponds. These may be areas of compaction or areas where, in this case, the downspouts are not working and the gutters are clogged and just compacting the soil every time it rains. So the idea here is that you're building on this information bank you have for your property. One of the most fun parts of site assessment can be the plant and animal part. I am in the process of creating a vegetable garden for the first time in my life right now. And I happen to have what my partner calls a whistle pig living in the yard, which is a groundhog. And I'm terrified of what the damage that he's going to potentially wreak on all of my hard work. So one of the things we're trying to figure out right now through basically a site assessment of sorts is where he comes in and exits his home. And there's a number of different things that we can do to kind of make him live somewhere else. But this is a really important part of any landscape process, not only figuring out, do I have deer browse? Do I have groundhogs near, you know, do I have groundhogs really, period? Do I have a bunny issue? We love wildlife, but there are things we can do to prevent them from damaging our investment or even the habitat we're enhancing. So it's important to look out for signs of varmints or other forms of wildlife. It's also important to look for indicator species. If you see skunk cabbage, for example, that's a great indication that you have a wetland on your property that you should stay away from. When when I work with folks in coastal areas, if they see, Rosa rugosa popping up or American beach grass, those are indications that there was a dune there in the past, perhaps, and that they probably should let that dune community revert. The most fun part of the plant process is figuring out what plants you have already on your property, and then figuring out where there are opportunities to put more stuff in. And so we have this great resource that's Rhode Island specific called the Rhode Island Native Plant Guide that I created with some colleagues about 5+ years ago, I think. I'm not really sure. I don't remember anymore. Yeah, it's about 4 or 5 years old at this point. But what you can do in the spirit of what we're talking about is pull these menus down and put characteristics that you've discovered through site assessment in to sort out a list of plants. And so if I quickly I'm just going to bring this up. You can still see my screen, yeah? Okay. So for example, if we were at my friend Eric Gardner, who's here with us on his property, and we had just determined that he had an area that was full sun, and pretty dry, and he needed a plant that was 3 to 6 feet or so, preferably a shrub, and we hit search. This will sort out the plants that meet those very specific criteria that I just entered, which is, for a designer, a dream. And all of these, if you can see, let me get my pointer back here somehow, where it says T, that's the type of plant. FS is full sun. SH is shade. So all of these yellow letters have a meaning, and you can click on them and see the definition. But this is basically a list of shrubs that only grow 3 to 6 feet tall and will tolerate drought and full sun conditions. So really, if you do site assessment and use this native plant guide resource, all of your plants are going to live. So what's better than that? Nothing, I think. Let me go back to my presentation. So I'm just going to keep going, being mindful of the time. Another resource we have, which is particularly useful if you have a coastal site, obviously, it's called the Rhode Island Coastal Plant Guide. This resource is about 13 years old. I created this when I was in college or graduate school. It's older, but it's still relevant. This is the list of plants that the Coastal Resources Management Council actually approves for use in coastal buffer zones. Why it might be relevant to you is that these plants will tolerate high wind exposure, salt spray, salt in soil, full sun, kind of the conditions that are often present in the coastal environment. So if you have a tough site, like right next to the road, maybe, where they put salt down, and it's on an edge, so it's getting full sun, maybe, this is a good list to use. It's a smaller list of plants, only about 230, all native to Rhode Island, and there's a lot of different fields. You can even search for rain garden. So big proponent of that. The other thing I want to mention, this is a resource that we created with help from my dear colleague Rosie, who passed away a year ago tomorrow. She always said the weeds can tell you a lot, and we kind of interpreted this information that was in her brain and turned it into this resource for all of you. And basically what this is this is the front side. So if you see, for example, a weed in your lawn that's keeping you up at night, or that you really just don't want there anymore, and that's okay, figure out what it is, either by using the front of this resource or by using a weed ID sheet. And then on the back, And this really gets plant nerds and tree huggers like me going. On the back, it actually tells you, okay, I identified goosegrass and crabgrass in my lawn. Well, the two things that those plants, or actually there's three things it has in common. One is that you have low nitrogen in your soil. So you see how this is shaded for crabgrass and goosegrass? This means you need to add a little bit of fertilizer with N in it, or nitrogen, at an appropriate rate. And you would only know that if you had a full soil test done, which is something everyone should do. And I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing is that crabgrass and goosegrass are indicators of soil compaction, which means the particles are really pushed together. There's not a lot of air flowing, and it's very difficult for water to get through. And so there are things you can do, like adding in sand if you need to. Otherwise, maybe you don't want to grow lawn in that place, just saying. The other thing that crabgrass and goosegrass have in common is, or that it indicates, is that the grass is thin. And this is funny because the grass is probably thin due to the low nitrogen and soil compaction. So my point here is that if you identify the weed and then look to see what it's actually showing you, you can avoid what we tend to do, which is see the weed, not ID it, drive to the store, buy a weed killer, apply a chemical that then goes into the storm drain and ends up in a stream and then Narragansett Bay. We don't want any of you to do that. So this resource is available. If you Google URI gardening resources, you'll come up with it. It's a really wonderful, wonderful resource that I have printed and keep up on the fridge. It's very useful. So once you have information about vegetation and wildlife, you add that to another layer, or you can just continue to add this information to one drawing. And that brings us to the last category, which is soil. Many of you probably know and believe and are on the same page as me when I say this is the foundation of a healthy landscape. You can't grow plants without soil unless it's an air plant. And if you have unhealthy soil, that means that the soil may not have the nutrients plants need to survive. It might not be supporting insects that manage bad insects, which I'll talk about, and it might be easily compacted, and that causes a number of problems for water quality. So you want to know, number one, what your soil pH is. This is a soil pH testing meter here. COVID-19 has completely thrown a wrench in the Cooperative Extension's ability to soil test for free through the Master Gardener program, unfortunately, but you can still send your soil away. The Yukon Soil Lab is still open as far as I know, the last time I checked. And having a soil test done is one of the best things you can do to inform yourself about what you're dealing with. They can also give you your organic matter content levels and test for other things like heavy metals and micronutrients, depending on what you want to find out. So really encourage all of you to get a soil test. You can Google Yukon Soil Testing Lab and find out more information. Another thing you can do to figure out your soil texture is do this, as I snarkily say, very scientific ball test, which is literally getting a ball of soil like this person has in this image, rolling it into a ball in your hand, and then this is my camera, going like this with your hand with the ball of soil. And as I'm saying here, if that soil ball breaks with just a little bit of pressure, like if you can picture yourself on a beach and you rolled some sand in your hand, if it even stayed together, it's going to break apart really easily. That means your soil particles are big and your drainage is very good. On the other side, if you roll a ball in your hand and you're going like this and it's staying exactly in the same shape that it was when you rolled it into a ball, that means that you have smaller particles, smaller soil particles like silt or clay. And that means that your soil is not well drained. And if you have poorly drained soil, there are certain things you cannot do, like grow a healthy Kentucky bluegrass lawn, or plants that like to have wet roots, or have a rain garden. If your soil doesn't drain well, you either have to do something about that or rethink what you're going to do in that particular area. So kind of the middle of the road is if the ball breaks apart or changes shape, you have loam or loamy silt, which is actually preferred. You want to kind of be somewhere in the middle. Another test you can do is a ribbon test. There's a lot here on this slide, but it's pretty straightforward. You get a Tootsie Roll sized piece of soil in your fingers, and oh, there's my camera. You push it forward in your finger like this. The longer the ribbon is when you're pushing it on your finger, the less well drained the soil is. So again, on the other side of that, if you picture sitting on the beach making a sandcastle with a kid, or maybe with an adult, that's fine. If you try to put beach sand in your finger and push it forward, it's going to fall immediately down. So that's that first bullet right here. If the ribbon breaks at less than 1 inch long and feels gritty in your fingertips, that's sandy. You have sand, and that means that your soil's very well drained. If your ribbon is pretty long when you do this test, you have clay soil, and as I'm saying here, I'm really sorry. The good news is that we don't have a lot of clay in Rhode Island. Aquidneck Island has pretty shallow topsoil layer and high ledge in places, but in general, we don't have a ton of clay, which is helpful. So the ribbon test is another great way to determine texture. The other thing you can look out for, and your soil can tell you a ton. I'm only scratching the surface, but if you were to dig down and you ever saw something like this bottom image here, this is anoxic soil. The reddish orange color is basically an indication that there is no airflow in between these soil particles. If you ever saw this, which would be pretty rare in this area, you would know immediately that you're not going to grow a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. You're not going to put plants that prefer drought conditions, and all these other things, because this soil is not having much airflow or water flow through it. On the other hand, if you see ponding, like is in this top picture, that tells me that during a rain event, like we simulated in that perk test 45 minutes ago, this soil is already saturated by the rain that already fell, and it's already starting to pond. So this soil drainage is not great. Another thing you can look for poorly drained soils is the presence of species like willow, pin oak, swamp oak, tupelo, species that grow in wetland environments. So you'll want to then add all of this soil information to your base map. And I show this last, but this and the information you gather about water are incredibly important parts of this process. So I encourage you to think hard about that stuff. And lastly, the social characteristics of the landscape are not often things people think about, but we tend to put ourselves first, and in site assessment, people matter. And so, one of the questions I'll ask myself when I'm going through this process is, how do people use the space now? How do they move through it? And I give you these images. This is clearly someone is a bocce aficionado, and they have, a very obviously marked recreation area here for very serious bocce, and that's great. So they probably want to do everything in their power to make sure this lawn is 2 inches tall and uniform. The bottom left picture is showing a trash area. So if you were going through site assessment in that the built stage in the beginning, you want to mark off where you keep your trash, because pretty sure you would agree that you're not going to want to site like a seating area next to where you keep your trash cans. So again, the more you know. And then I show this image of the path, A, because it was a beautiful hike I took, but also B, this is a very clear indication that there's a circulation pattern going through the woods right here. And if you have areas on your property where the soil is bare or the soil gets very muddy, I have that going on at my house. These are indications of normal human circulation. And so you're not, you know, if this was someone's backyard, you're not going to put a table and chairs in the middle of this pathway, or you're not going to put a volleyball net up. I'm being a little bit funny with that, but you know, the landscape will tell you a lot. So look for these kinds of things and ask yourself these questions. And then most importantly, mark circulation patterns and high use areas on your map. So that is basically all of the inventory. That's all the information you'd want to gather. It's already 8:02, so I'm going to keep rolling, and I hope you guys will stay with me because I'm just getting to the fun part, and I knew this would happen, but I'm going to just quickly talk about where you go from here. So you just gathered all of this information. Maybe you only gathered like 1 or 2 categories, which is fine. You don't always have to know everything about everything right away. The other thing is that a lot of the examples I was showing you were entire property site assessments. And really, you can do site assessment on a 20 square foot area if you want. I mean, you really do this to serve yourself. And so just because I'm showing examples of entire properties doesn't mean this is the only application. But what you want to do after you gather all this information is ask yourself, what is all this telling me about areas of opportunity I may have? For example, if, and I'll just show you what happens with a trained eye. If I just look at this right now, and I'm basically, this looks like an existing property. They gather a lot of information about what's going on already. I'll take this. So the open exposed feeling on the left. If when you did an inventory of this site and this was all open sod, you notice here there's no fence and it feels open and exposed. The existing trees are healthy. There's some shrubs here. This is a play area, but this corner of the property is pretty much wide open. And the good views, it looks like maybe are coming out this way. This may be an area where you would choose to invest in a privacy screen. I would need a little bit more information to figure out by talking to the person what they were going for, but I guess the example I'm giving is you step back, you have all this information in front of you about sun and wind and where the utility lines are and where people walk and where the existing plants are that you want to keep, where the existing plants are that you want to take away. And from that information, you can make decisions about 2 things. 1, where you want to change something to make it better. And 2, where you want to change something to fix a problem. So if I'm looking for an area, I guess I kind of did that here, where maybe the issue was that there wasn't enough privacy, you put plants in to solve that. Another example would be there's some erosion occurring in the backyard here. It doesn't look like this is an area where recreation happens, but there is a patio, and so it wouldn't be a horrible thing to site a new garden here that was visible from the patio that would stop the sediment from flowing downhill. So I could go on forever, and I have this wackadoodle Jackson Pollock looking thing down here because most likely your site assessment map will look like this, not like this, and that's okay as long as you can read it. So I'm going to look at the chat really quick and just make sure there's nothing Chuck the Groundhog on Instagram. I will look at that. So are there plans to update the plant list in the future? That's contingent on funding, like everything else. I would love to update them. But there are no plans at this time. And this is a great question. So Kyle's asking, you know, as species compositions change, I assume you mean with climate change, and also as our knowledge of how important native plants are increases, are those plants available from growers and nurseries? And I would say yes, because the demand is definitely driving supply now. And I have seen since I started working in this field 15 years ago that, you know, in 2005, people were not talking about native plants, and it was very hard to find, you know, anything more than maybe clethra and highbush blueberry at a garden center. Now you can find a lot of plants, and that is really testament to how much people are asking for them. So, you know, knowledge is power. Your voice is important, and I would encourage all of you to talk to your local garden centers about the importance of them having native plants for your use. So this is the fun part. I just have a few slides, but if you are using all of your site assessment information to think about how to design some plantings on your property, I'm letting you into my brain and sharing with you how I approach doing this. And my approach is always that I take cues from the natural environment. And I know that if we put plants in the ground, we are creating different kinds of habitats depending on what they are. And habitat is great for wildlife, but plants are also great for water quality protection, and they also preserve our sense of place when we use natives. And so this part of the presentation is specifically around plants, which I would encourage you to learn more about specific natives by looking at the plant guide that I showed you. The first thing that I always commit myself to is using native species. It's really important for supporting pollinators and beneficial insects that control pests. Supporting pollinators keeps our food supply secure and a number of other different and very important environmental functions. And so it's really important as we lose natural areas for us to incorporate native plants into our backyards. And it's a really simple thing to do. So this is a native sedge with Virginia creeper vine. I love this picture. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Select native species when you can, again, using this native plant guide to enter information you've determined through your site inventory. You can set these fields. You can even set, if you want plants that will attract butterflies, you can do that. A lot of great tools here for choosing natives. The other thing is that it's always a great idea to look at the existing landscape and ask yourself, is there anywhere that I could convert from ideally pavement into vegetation, but if not pavement, grass? Can I replace some grass with vegetation? Or can I beef up my existing garden bed and put even more plants? Or can I, as I said before, you know, I'm all about reverting lawn and back into woodland and or shrubland or early successional habitat or whatever it is. So I always ask myself when I am on sites, is there any part of this site that could be reclaimed and recommitted to being vegetated? And I show this little snapshot of a natural plant community from a document that Rick Enser wrote called Natural Plant Communities of Rhode Island, because in many places there are still remnants of our natural plant communities present. And if you find certain species and reference them in that resource, which I will type in the chat so you can find it, Rick Enser, Natural Plant Communities of Rhode Island. We really want folks to try to bring those those plant communities back where possible. So if you live on a larger area of land and you find a stand of red oaks with a witch hazel understory, that might indicate that that used to be an oak hickory forest. And we would love it if you planted all of these species back on that land to restore that plant community. That's basically the point there. And if you can't do that, just adding native species is a definite plus. The next thing is, and this is obviously a Pacific Northwest picture, but I think it shows what I'm talking about very well, which is that in nature, more often than not, species exist in clusters or colonies. And definitely over the past 20, 30 years, we've gotten into this habit of like planting one thing over here and one thing over here and maybe a different thing over here, when in reality, there's no reason why we can't recreate what nature does. And that just means that instead of planting one shad bush, you buy 3 and you put 3 of them in the ground together. Or instead of buying 2 columbine and putting them in 2 different gardens, you buy 5, or you buy 3 and you put them all together so that as they grow up, they become a swath. And so I say here, cluster like species densely, because that is mimicking what a forest environment does, which is basically the most supreme example of function we have. I hope that makes sense. The other thing that's really important to think about that I think folks are getting more hip to, and what this image shows like the other one does, is that in a forest, for example, there are multiple vertical layers that exist. You have, you know, if you think about stepping onto a hiking trail, I'll spare you the meditation tonight, but if you picture walking onto a hiking trail, you're hearing, you know, leaves rustling above your head, and maybe something pokes you in the neck, and you keep walking and you get tickled on your stomach, and something scrapes you on your shin, and you're hearing crunching under your feet. Well, all of that are all of these different vertical layers in the forest. And what we really would benefit from all over the earth is if people recreated those vertical layers in their backyards and on their land, private lands and public lands. Because if you picture a raindrop falling on this ecosystem on the Cape, where the picture came from, by the time that rain reaches the ground, it's only going to be a shadow of what it was when it was a full raindrop. Same thing in this image. By the time that any rain that falls in this forest reaches that pathway where there is texture on the ground even, it might not even be a raindrop anymore if it even ever reaches the ground. And so both for habitat reasons and for stormwater management and water quality protection, we want different vertical layers of vegetation. It helps with habitat value more than I can stress. The other really important thing is to not do what the person in the picture on the left has allowed to happen in their backyard, which is that they cleared the understory under these larger trees. And in the process, when they took all the of the understory out, which was probably shrubs, perennials, maybe even annuals, the root systems died, and all of a sudden that soil was bare. And because there aren't as many roots there, the soil is probably compacted, and that is why there's a pretty intense sheet of water flowing downhill, probably causing tremendous problems for that downhill neighbor with ponding. But I guarantee you, if this person had either appropriate turf grass species, probably fescue would be better than bluegrass, which is what they have there, that situation would be improved. Or better yet, if that person had an understory planted or even garden beds planted to soak up some of that sheet flow, this image would not look this way after a rain event. So it's really important that we keep the ground plane covered with vegetation when possible. It's the same reason we tell people not to walk on dunes. The minute we interrupt dune species roots, they're undermined and they can loosen up, and then the sand blows away and the dune isn't there, and the dunes are the things that protect us from storm surge. So again, roots play a tremendous role in protecting the vitality of an ecosystem, and the more roots you have, the better off you are. Almost done. The other thing that's really important is preserving the leaf litter layer. All that crunching under your feet when you're hiking, there's so much going on that we can't even see. And so I'm not going to get into cultural practices tonight, but I always talk to people about how important it is to keep all of the natural biomass like leaves and twigs and grass clippings and all of the plant matter you generate on your property. What I do here in West Greenwich and what I did in Warwick when I lived there and pretty much every place before, you rake it up into a row and run a lawnmower over it a few times, chop it up, and guess what you have? Free mulch, where all of the microorganisms and bacteria, just to name a few things, are still intact. And if you apply that back onto your more formal garden beds or on the woodland floor, if you're up against a forested environment, you'll keep all your natural pest protectors on your property, as opposed to bagging it up and throwing it in the trash and then going out to a garden center and buying a plastic bag of dyed shredded bark mulch. So two things: if you can leave the leaves where they are and not rake, that's the best thing you can do. But if you do need to rake up organic matter, it's really great to keep it on your property. Those are the two take-home messages there. You can very easily provide habitat for beneficial insects by following this bullet here, which says that if you arrange plants in diverse groups that have varying heights and shapes, that bloom at different times and produce nectar and pollen, which many plants do, you will inadvertently or advertently be supporting beneficial insects that eat pest insects. And there's a lot of literature, a lot more information on that I'd encourage you all to look into if you want to know more. This is really important, and one of the reasons that we hire gardeners and horticulturists to choose plants for us, because there's a lot you can do to support pollinators if you make good plant choices. I think this is the last one. Many of you probably have seen this before. I hope you have, but we have a ornithologist at the university named Scott McWilliams who studies birds. And he did this really neat research project probably, 10 years ago now, 8 to 10 years ago, looking at different native plants and their fat, carbohydrate, and protein content. So he took the fruit or the seeds of different natives, analyzed them in a lab, and determined how valuable they are to migrating birds. This is like super cool. This is very relevant to Rhode Island. So this top box that says highly recommended and preferred, there's a list of 5 plants there, with the exception of pokeweed, which is a native plant, high habitat value, but also stains your clothes and is poisonous to humans if you eat the berries. All of those plants are tremendously valuable to migrating birds that are flying thousands of miles over us, and either stopping here or continuing. And so any of the plants on this list in this box or below where it says common elderberry and then moving down are very valuable to migrating birds. And so we'd encourage all of you to plant those if you can. All of these resources are available if you Google URI gardening resources, by the way. So we have lots of free services that are offered through Cooperative Extension at the university. Again, we're responsible for bringing science out into communities to help people solve problems. I've been talking about stuff that's very relevant to horticulture and maybe agriculture. And many of these resources I'm showing here are also relevant to that. Right now, we do not have people staffing the hotline in person because of social distancing requirements, but we do have trained Master Gardener volunteers answering emails from home. So if you email gardener@uri.edu, someone will get back to you with an answer to your question within 3 business days, which is pretty amazing. And they will get back to you with a science-based answer to your question, which is very important. We also have a plant protection clinic that is operating, but at a much reduced capacity. And so that if you have a plant that's diseased or a pest that you can't figure out what it is and the hotline can't help you, we will actually send it along to Heather Fobert in the picture there in the blue, who will diagnose it, and that costs just $10. And for future reference, we have this tremendous Master Gardener program that I administer in my capacity through Cooperative Extension with my cousin Vanessa, actually. And we offer a number of services in the community, many of which are on hold right now, but this is also part of the reason we're offering webinars, is to make sure that people are still getting access to this information during this incredibly strange time. So if you have questions, I am more than willing to spend until 8:30 answering anything that I didn't answer already. Otherwise, every Tuesday at 7 and Friday at noon, someone is offering information around horticulture in May and June. And then moving throughout the summer, my colleagues, both faculty and staff, and some volunteers, will be teaching about topics outside of horticulture. So maybe some energy stuff, land stewardship, water resources. So do mark your calendars and stay posted on Facebook. The last request I have, and this is really important, I'm going to copy a link quickly into our chat box. And if you all don't mind spending probably less than 100 seconds on this, we have a survey. Here it is. I'm just going to copy this link for you.